When you challenge with curiosity, the stated purpose is discovery. It's not victory. And you have to do it genuinely, including the possibility that the other person knows something that you might not know. By using this approach, though, either the other person discovers something that they were missing, or you discover what you were missing. And both outcomes are wins. Both outcomes improve the decision. And when people realize that you were asking because you genuinely wanted to understand, not because you're building a case against them. And that's where your authenticity and your genuineness have to come in. But it shifts the dynamic in the room entirely. And I think CHROs who master this get called in early because their questions are known to make things better and not harder.
Hey there, senior leader, and welcome to the Talent Sherpa podcast. This is where senior leaders come to rethink how human capital really works. I'm your host, Jackson Lynch, and today I'm joined by my co-host, Scott Morris. He's a former CHRO with the scar tissue to prove it, the alleged owner of a coffee mug that just says culture, and the founder of Propulsion AI. Now, Scott, nobody talks about this one openly, but I think it's one of the most career-defining moments that shows up in all of the CHRO role. And I've watched really talented HR leaders lose influence in rooms that they deserve to keep, not because they didn't know their stuff, not because the CEO was unreachable, because when the moment came to push back on something really important, they either swallowed it and kept quiet, or they came in so hard that the room went cold. And once that happens, the decisions keep moving, but without you.
Yeah, so today we are going to talk about what it actually takes to challenge something in a senior room and come out the other side with more trust than you walked in with. But before we dive in, do us a favor, folks. Please subscribe to the podcast. Leave us a comment or drop us a quick review on your preferred platform. It's how we grow the pod, how we keep the content sharp for senior leaders. It's a small favor for us, but it's potentially a big favor for somebody else.
Okay, Scott, every CHRO has been told some version of this: earn your influence, like be credible, speak the language of business, be strategic, not tactical. And most of the CHROs that I know and work with have done that work. They understand the P&L. They can talk margin and risk. They see the constraint impacting business performance. They work to relax it. They know where the talent gaps are before the CEO does. But what we're going to talk about today is knowing the answer and being able to influence the outcome, because those are two completely different skills. And the gap between them is not analytical. It is behavioral.
You know, and the gap has a name, actually, and it's not confidence. You know, like you, I've met plenty of confident CHROs who were systemically excluded from key decisions. What it really comes down to is how you challenge. Because if you don't challenge, you're not adding value. And if you challenge badly, you lose access.
That's right. And here's what makes this so interesting. Accenture published research showing that 89% of CEOs believe that their CHROs should have a central role in driving long-term growth. 89%. That is not a small minority. That is near universal belief. But here's the number that actually matters. Only 45% of those same CEOs are creating the conditions to let the CHRO have that impact. So the belief is there, but the access isn't. And I would argue that a big chunk of that access gap is a behavioral pattern problem, not a structural one.
Walk us through what you mean, because I think a lot of CHROs might hear that and think it's a politics problem or it's a power problem, and not something that they can actually move. Walk us through it.
Well, maybe think about it this way. We know from Amy Edmondson's research at Harvard that new hires enter organizations feeling super optimistic and confident. And then over time, they feel less and less safe speaking up. And that decay happens at every level across, including the C-suite. No one thinks that we're immune to this, but people think that we might be immune to this, but we're not. It happens at every level. But here's what is really interesting. The Wiley research on psychological safety shows that executives report the highest level of psychological safety, 93%, but 76% of executives say that they feel safe taking interpersonal risk. So think about that gap. The gap is between feeling safe and actually acting on that safety and taking risks. That's the behavioral gap I'm talking about. And for CHROs, to be honest, the risk calculus is real. If you speak up wrong, you're going to get cut out of conversations where your input actually matters. Or you can go silent and you become irrelevant. So what we're really talking about today is a third path, and it requires a very specific skill. Scott, can you name it?
Yeah, it's challenging with curiosity. It's not the absence of a challenge, and it's not a challenge delivered as an indictment, but it's challenge delivered as a question that opens thinking rather than closes it. It's a skill that determines whether CHROs become strategic voices or whether they get quietly relegated to process management level with a decent salary. It's not just the CHRO's career that's on the line. When CHROs go silent, the organization starts to run into risks that it can't see. And when the CHRO challenges badly, the same thing happens because they stop getting pulled into conversations early.
Okay, well, let's maybe call out a few of the faulty assumptions that get leaders stuck. The first one is, if I speak up more clearly and directly, people will respect me more. But yeah, I'm the reform smoker on this one. I'm a direct communicator. And I thought as long as I am saying the thing, life will be good. So think about it like the CHRO who goes into the AI deployment meeting and says, this model is biased instead of, I'm looking at the pass-through rates across candidate groups. What are we seeing here? Like the same concerns, but they're completely different outcomes based upon how you do it. The assumption is if you're clear and direct, that's somehow always a virtue. Bluntness is honesty. If someone is uncomfortable, that's their problem, not mine. Yeah, like you go back earlier in my career, this was me. I think I've grown since then. How you say it determines whether you are heard or tolerated. And I had a coach that once helped shape this for me. Do you want to be right or do you want to be effective? Directness is a delivery mode. It's not a strategy. It's not alignment. When challenging lands as an accusation or a conclusion, it triggers defensiveness. The other person stops processing and they kind of start shielding and protecting. So what happens? Your brilliant insight, completely ignored.
You said that one applied to you. I got to tell you, man, that it applies to me too. And I get an exponent because I'm passionate about things. And that passionate just multiplies that directness. And it's one that I wish I could say was in my past career, but it's not. It's one I constantly have to worry about as well. Here's a second one. And it's the other side of the one you just painted. Going silent is the safe move when the room gets charged. What I think is interesting, Jackson, is that the research shows 50% of employees believe that their ideas are not going to get taken seriously. And I think sometimes we, and I mean you and I, when we talk about this, and people broadly, like CHROs are not immune to that, right? We're people just like everybody else. And sometimes the stakes are just higher because of who we influence. The assumption here is that staying quiet is going to somehow avoid conflict and is going to preserve your relationships that you need for later. And you can raise concerns later through the right channels. But the reality is that silence isn't neutral. It's a choice and it has consequences on both sides. And later, regrettably, is often never. And when the thing that you saw earlier surfaces as a crisis, you're not just credited, you're often implicated for not saying anything.
Yeah, that's a really interesting one to bring up, Scott, because I've had people that have worked for me, and it's one of the things that just frustrated me. They would go to these meetings. They knew the right answer. They didn't say a word, and then they bring it to me and give it to me like I'm supposed to solve the problem. It's like, you were in the meeting. Come on. That's why you get paid a lot of money. But they felt so much more comfortable being silent in that moment. So
I'll do.
So the third one that I had is a corollary to my first one, and that's my credibility comes from being right. And think about this: like, when's the last time you changed your mind in a meeting because someone told you definitively that you were wrong? Like, never. You dig. I dig in. Okay. Now, think about the last time a question made you see something that you missed. That happens all the time. The second experience is the currency of senior influence. The first one just kind of shuts stuff down. So the assumption that I think is faulty is if I have the data and the analysis, my position will prevail on the merits. The substance will win. But back to what I said, do you want to be right or do you want to be effective? The reality is the credibility in the room comes from how you show up in the conversation, not just whether your conclusions are correct. Being right is table stakes. You should be right more than you're wrong. But being useful in real time is the differentiator. And people and leaders who have the ability to make others around them think better, they earn access. People who make the people around them defensive lose access, regardless of whether you're right or wrong to begin with.
Let me hit the next one. And it's that challenging with questions is soft somehow, or that maybe it lacks conviction. And I think this is the move that separates CHROs who get called in early from CHROs who get briefed on kind of what already got decided. The assumption here is that asking questions rather than stating positions signals some kind of uncertainty or passivity, and that strong leaders, they take positions. But the reality is that questioning is one of the highest leverage leadership moves that is available to anybody. So the question, if overall accuracy looks strong, but certain groups advance at a much lower rate, what might that be telling us? That's not soft. In fact, it's really precise. It surfaces the assumption underneath the metric without assigning blame. The question can change a deployment decision. A statement can't, for the reason that you brought up earlier, because a defensive response is going to shut the door. The question opens it.
Yeah, I think that fourth one is the one that costs people the most, because the instinct is to demonstrate conviction by stating positions. Like that, we're wired to do it that way, I think. And let's be honest, you get promoted by having answers. And then you get in the room where the skill you need isn't to have the right answer, it's to have the right question. And no one ever told you that those rules changed.
Yeah, the job changed the day you walked into that room. You're not there to be the smartest person with the data. You're there to help the room make better decisions. And those aren't always the same thing. So how do we move from challenge as conclusion to challenge as discovery? Let's think of it as a 3-move framework. 3 moves a CHRO can make in any charged conversation to stay in the room, stay useful, and actually shift the outcome.
All right, Scott, why don't you take off on move 1? You're naturally way better at this than I am. So you take number 1.
I always am nervous when you say that, because you are better at so much more stuff than I am. But I'll take the first one. And that is slow the certainty. Most bad challenges happen at speed, when the energy is running, when the passion is there. Someone says something feels wrong and the instinct is to correct it immediately. But speed, I think, here is the enemy. When you slow down in a charged moment, you signal confidence rather than reactivity. You have time to choose your entry point. You move from reacting to responding. And so practically, that means building 2 or 3 seconds into your pattern before you speak. It means noticing when your body is moving into correction mode and deliberately shifting into inquiry mode. That's not passive. In fact, it's just the opposite. You're choosing how to engage rather than letting the moment choose it for you. The question to ask yourself in that moment is, it's not, how do I respond to what was just said? It's the assumption underneath what was just said. And how do I get that assumption into the conversation without triggering the room? Here's where I see it in myself. When I start to lean in like this and the passion moves, I know I'm moving on the emotion rather than listening to the underlying assumption. And I have to sit back and force myself into that sort of more intellectual mode rather than emotional mode.
Yeah, and let me maybe, if I could, a little story time on what that looks like real time. So the former CHRO that I replaced was placed in one of those positions in front of the board. And the CEO said something that was inherently inaccurate. but also one that like sometimes you need to manage through it. My predecessor said, okay, I'm going to correct the boss in front of his bosses real time. Now he was right. Did I mention that he was my predecessor? Like he didn't make it through the week. And so it's not, and candidly, it wasn't that big of a deal. It was like, kind of, did we do step one or step two first versus step two versus step one? It wasn't a big deal. It wasn't an ethical component or any of that, but just, he wanted to be right. And yeah, so what the boss said made him look a little bad. Okay, you take one for the team in there, then you have the conversation afterwards that say, hey, I wasn't going to correct you in the room, but I want to make sure you and I are thinking about this the same way. Here's my view. Do you have a different one? Like, those are the right conversations to have. Now, I'm glad that he said it, because that I was able to have a really cool run with the company, but like, don't do that. So, okay, here's move number 2. I think you name the data. You don't name the conclusion. And so what do I mean by that? I think there's a moment in every challenged conversation where a CHRO has 2 choices. They state what they believe, which closes the loop, or they name what they're observing. Naming the data sounds something like I was looking at the pass-through rates across candidate groups, and I noticed some differences. How did we evaluate those in the model design? And like yours before, that's not a soft question. Like, that is a very precise question aimed at the assumption underneath the metric. But you're asking how. It invites the other person to surface the thing themselves. And it might be that they didn't actually do it, which is probably what happened in this case, right? When they surface it themselves, though, they own it and they're not defensive. If you raise it, now you're putting them in a different spot. So I think that's fundamentally more powerful than just telling them. So contrast that. The model is biased and we should not deploy it. That might be true. Let's close the door. The I team is now defending their work instead of examining it. You were right, and congratulations, now you're irrelevant.
But you know what, Jackson, let me push back on that just for a second, because I worry that some people might hear that and think about that as like political softness. I mean, isn't there a time to just say the thing directly?
Of course there is. So think about it. When the stakes are legal or they're ethical, you've exhausted the inquiry path, you need to escalate. Yeah. And over the course of doing this for 30 years, it happens occasionally, but it's not every conversation. And when it does happen, I think that's a different conversation entirely. But most of the moments that the CHROs face in any given week, it's not that. Okay. This decision is heading in a direction that I see differently than the room, and I need to redirect it. And you do that better by naming the data without the conclusion. I think that is the most powerful move available.
Let me go to number 3. Move number 3. Seek what you might be missing. So I borrowed this one from what I've taught other HR leaders and managers to do for years in performance management. Start out with the assumption you don't know and get an inquiry going that uncovers the truth as if you didn't know that it was there. And this is the move that challenges the category. When you challenge with curiosity, the stated purpose is discovery. It's not victory. And that means genuinely, and you have to do it genuinely, including the possibility that the other person knows something that you might not know. By using this approach, though, either the other person discovers something that they were missing, or you discover what you were missing. And both outcomes are wins. Both outcomes improve the decision. And when people realize that you were asking because you genuinely wanted to understand, not because you're building a case against them. And that's where your authenticity and your genuineness have to come in. But it shifts the dynamic in the room entirely. And I think CHROs who master this get called in early because their questions are known to make things better and not harder. That reputation, I mean, you and I resist using the seat at the table analogy, but that reputation is the seat at the table that no org chart and no title are going to give you.
The 2 words I want to call out and double click on are genuine and authentic, because you can actually ask a question in a non-genuine or inauthentic way and come across as a real dick.
It's worse.
And that's not what I'm suggesting, right? Um, I had a situation, real story time, where we were making a decision as part of an employment practice that was something I found to be wrong. And it probably moved into that kind of unethical, too risky legal issue. And I still took the approach of, hey, have we considered what would happen when? And the data would suggest that we're doing this, but 35%, 37% of the time, it's not doing what we think it's going to go do. Have we calculated the potential cost when? And I could have asked that question in a, look, we're doing this. Have you actually really thought through what would happen if this happened?
It's a total accusation.
Right? So how you deliver it matters much too. So for me, I guess, Scott, the real question is, are CHROs willing to stop leading with their conclusions and start leading with the questions? And you mentioned before, that's not soft. I think it requires a level of confidence that's actually harder than being direct. And this is coming from a guy that kind of, I'm a direct guy. It requires you to trust that the question is more powerful than the answer. And I have found that is absolutely what happens.
I mean, I think we've named it, and we've called out the elements and the assumptions. Let's make this practical and turn this into a playbook. Why don't you lead us off with how a CHRO can start doing this week one?
So what I would do is, people probably get tired of me saying you should audit things, but I think you need to audit your last 3 weeks of meetings. Go into the meeting notes that you have, look at the moments where you had a concern, and then evaluate. Did you say something? Did you come in too hard? Did you ask questions? Did you provide clear, definitive answers? Like, don't judge the outcome. Just use it to identify the pattern. Most HROs have a consistent behavioral default. And, as I mentioned, I come from a long line of alcoholics. First step is to admit you have a problem. So knowing what your behavioral default is really important. That's the critical starting point, because you can't interrupt a pattern that you can't see.
I like that you said that, because I think number two move is you've got to write some observations about data before you go into the meeting. Not conclusions and not recommendations, but observations. Like, when I look at X, I notice Y. And if you practice converting conclusions into observations before you're in the room, that starts to build that muscle. And that's really critical, because when, the stakes are low, that's easier to do it. And it becomes available when the stakes are high.
Again, let me reinforce the muscle building thing that you mentioned. I think that's really, really wise and smart. And I probably have a reputation of being able to analytically get to the thing behind the thing at a pretty high clip. Yeah. And one of my challenges has been, I get there and the rest of the room is still in a different place, which makes it very hard for me to influence the room. And so I was not good at the question asking. I was really good at identifying it. Here's what I see. And everyone else is like, what is he talking about? But the more you practice the questions, and those questions can be really, really, really precise and insightful, and you get really good at it, it becomes easier. And now it's just naturally what I do. Hey, boy, this seems like I'm noticing this. Have you thought about the other implications there? I'm curious as to what you might uncover. You're basically telling the person they didn't think this all the way through, but you're doing it in a way that allows them to kind of get to that conclusion themselves, and you do it in a teaching way. And then all of a sudden you can then reinforce and lock that in and move on. Anyway, here's number 3. I think I've used this a lot, and it's using a bridge phrase. And I think if I could ask you to write something down from the episode, it would be like, build this into your active vocabulary. Go write it down and practice it. Help me understand, and how have we evaluated? Or I am curious as to what we would see if, or what would it mean if the data showed? Like, These phrases, and you got to pick the one that works best for you, but these phrases signal inquiry without signaling uncertainty. And write them down, practice them, and when they become automatic, like that's when you know you've gotten there. And that's a choice. You can do this. It's not easy, but it is a practice skill.
Yeah, write them down and practice them, but make sure that it's in your authentic voice, because it's got to come out like an authentic question that you're really listening for the answer on, not one that you're using as a setup. Here's the fourth one. Here's the fourth move. Debrief one challenge conversation per week. After a meeting where you challenge something, take 5 minutes, write down what you said, write down what happened next, write down what you would do differently. And I think writing it down really here is important. It's a commitment, right? You're not going to invent it and replay a filtered version in your head. You're writing it down. This is the feedback loop that a lot of leaders skip, and you have to do it for yourself. But the CHRO who systematically learns from their own challenge conversations will compound faster than anybody around them.
Here's number 5. And in these, what do we do? I want to be thoughtful that we don't have these kind of panacea of solutions here that require a whole bunch of folks. Like we can own this in our personal sphere of control. So for a leader on your team, like model the move in your next meeting. So when one of your direct reports make a statement that feels incomplete, and your natural inclination would be to correct it, ask the question instead. Do it very visibly. Let others on the team watch you choose curiosity over conclusion. And especially if you have a history of doing the one thing, like that's the fastest way to shift the behavior in the meeting. And it will have a huge implication of the culture in your function. You cannot, in my view, install a skill that you don't personally demonstrate.
Well, and you know what the cool thing about that is, and I think it's a good suggestion that you're making, the stakes are going to feel lower in those conversations. And so it becomes easier to practice the simple things that we're suggesting that CHROs do. And again, that becomes muscle memory for when the stakes are higher. Can I throw a sixth one in?
Sure. There's a lot of help here this week.
Well, I think the sixth move would be identify the one conversation that you've been avoiding. We all have them. The conversation where something's off and you've kind of been calculating whether or not to raise it, that conversation. Write down the data observation, not the conclusion. Practice the question, and then have the conversation. The silence is already costing you. The question costs you less than you think.
Yeah, I think that one's probably the hardest for me. And most CHROs aren't going to do it this week. But I don't exactly know why, but sometimes that silence feels more protective, but it's not. It's all you're doing is delay. Okay. The risk doesn't go away. In fact, it compounds. So it's a set of skills that if you kind of practice them, you'll get better at them, and it'll increase your effectiveness as you move forward. So I think this was a really good set of things we can do on Monday. But we are at the part of the podcast, senior leaders, where this is, in fact, your talent Sherpa summary. Or, as Scott always says, the louder you say it, the more people will agree with you, even when you're completely wrong.
Yep. I think I've lived that one. I don't always say it, but I think I've lived it. All right, let me do the summary, Jackson. Number 1. Challenging with curiosity is not soft, it is precision. It's how you surface the thing underneath the thing without triggering the defensive response that closes the room. Number 2, silence and force are both exits. Silence removes you from influence. Force removes you from access. The third path is inquiry, delivered with genuine intent to discover. 3, the skill is learnable, and it's specifically learnable by CHROs because CHROs sit at this incredible intersection of people dynamics and business risk and decision-making authority. And that intersection is exactly where challenging with curiosity is going to matter most. Number 4, your credibility in the room is not built from being right. It's built from being useful. And the CHRO who makes the room better earns a different kind of access and I think a different kind of respect than the one who makes the room feel challenged.
Yeah, the big takeaway for me is the skill that keeps the CHROs in the room is not analysis, it's not being right, it's not credentials. By the way, in my first CHRO job, that's what I thought it was, but it's not. It's the ability to raise a hard thing in a way that opens the conversation rather than closes it. That is the behavioral edge. And it compounds. Every room you navigate, is going to increase your access to the next one. So learn to challenge well, and the influence is going to follow. That's it for this week. I want to thank everyone so much for tuning into the Talent Sherpa podcast. This is where senior leaders come to rethink how human capital really works. And this is so much fun to do with all of you. And I wanted to give a quick shout out to one of our favorite listeners. Hi, Drake from Baton Rouge. By the way, Drake is a CFO listening to the show. I want to thank you for being a part of the Talent Sherpa community. And we want to thank everyone for listening, whether it is in Salt Lake City, Utah, or Pretoria, South Africa. Yes, we've hit our 5th continent, and it's so great to have all of you with us. And we now have listeners, by the way, on 5 of the 7 continents. I don't think Antarctica is ever going to be in our future, but South America should be. So if you have a friend down in South America, please send them a note and ask them to start listening to the podcast. Scott actually speaks both Portuguese and Spanish, allegedly. And he's promised that if we get someone to listen, he'll do part of a segment in Spanish. Or
I speak Portuguese to correct your Portuguese, but I do speak Spanish. If you like today's episode, do us a favor and hit the like button, or better yet, subscribe to the podcast. Leave us a review on your favorite platform, whether that is Apple Podcasts or Spotify or YouTube. It's going to benefit the community if you would just take a moment and leave us a review. It's free, it's really helpful to us, and it might be helpful to somebody else.
And look, if you're a CHRO wondering where to start your AI journey, or if you're a CFO wondering where to start the AI journey for human capital, don't forget to check out Propulsion AI. I know this is hard to remember, getpropulsion.ai. They're building a team of AI teammates that help human capital leaders focus on what matters most to the business. Scott, remind us, what is it that you are helping people with these days?
Yeah, we use artificial intelligence as coaches for managers to do heavy lifting and to turn value creation plans into actual EBITDA. And don't forget, if you're an early stage CHRO, Jackson has helped a lot of people just like you, and to be honest, just like me, through personal coaching, through the CHRO Ascent Academy, and through his best-selling Substack. You can find access to all 3 of those things over at mytalentsherpa.com.
Thank you, Scott, and thanks to everyone who's listening. And until next time, keep raising the bar. Keep asking the question that opens the room, and keep on climbing.